The morning sun cast long shadows across the artificial lake at the Galactic Engineering Academy on Kepler 442b. Jake Morrison stood with his hands in his pockets, watching the water ripple in the gentle breeze. Around him, students from 12 different alien species chattered excitedly in their native tongues. Though the universal translators made sure everyone could understand each other, Professor Zix9 floated above the group in her shimmering crystalline form. Her body caught the sunlight and threw rainbow patterns across the sandy shore. She was one of the most respected teachers at the academy, known for her challenging projects and fair grading. Today, she would announce their final assignment for advanced maritime construction. "Students, gather around," Professor Zix9 called out, her voice ringing like wind chimes. "Today you face your ultimate test in this course." The various alien students moved closer. Jake noticed how different they all were. The Vorthans stood tall on their long legs, their 6 arms moving as they talked. Their elongated heads reminded Jake of Earth's giraffes, but their gray skin looked more like smooth stone. The Klaxons buzzed around in small groups, their insect-like bodies quick and jerky in movement. Their compound eyes seemed to look in all directions at once. Near the water's edge, the Nereids splashed playfully. They looked somewhat like Earth's dolphins, but walked on 2 legs when on land. Their blue-green skin glistened with moisture, and they seemed most comfortable when partially in the water. There were also the crystalloids like Professor Zix9, the plant-like verdans, and several other species. Jake was still learning to identify Dot as the only human exchange student at the academy. Jake often felt like an oddity. His classmates found human engineering methods strange. Where they relied on complex mathematics and perfect efficiency, humans seemed to build things by feel and intuition. Jake had learned to keep quiet about his different approach to avoid too many questions. "Your assignment is straightforward," Professor Zix9 continued. "You must build a watercraft capable of safely transporting 3 beings across this lake. You have access to our standard materials: biomatter, wood, cordage, sealants, and basic tools. Construction time is limited to 6 hours. Testing begins." At sunset, the students immediately began discussing strategies. Jake listened as the Vorthans started calculating optimal dimensions and weight distributions. Their mathematical approach was impressive, but seemed overly complicated for what should be a simple task. The Klaxons formed work groups and began dividing tasks with military precision. The Nereids dove into the lake to study water conditions and currents. Most teams seemed to be thinking along the same lines. Jake heard them talking about platforms, flat surfaces, and basic rafts. It made sense from an engineering standpoint. A flat raft was simple to build, used materials efficiently, and would definitely float. But Jake found himself thinking about something different. He walked over to the pile of materials while his classmates continued planning. The biomatter wood was similar to bamboo from Earth, lightweight but strong. The pieces varied in length and thickness. Most students were selecting the longest, straightest pieces for their raft frames. Jake picked up several pieces and felt their weight and flexibility. He remembered summer camps from his childhood, building boats with his grandfather, and stories of Pacific Islanders navigating vast oceans in vessels that seemed impossible by modern standards. Those ancient humans had not built simple rafts. They had created elegant boats that worked with the water rather than fighting it. Vorthan student named Kresh approached him. Kresh was the acknowledged leader of the Vorthan team and known for his brilliant engineering mind. His mathematical solutions were always perfect, even if they sometimes lacked creativity. "Human Jake," Kresh said in his formal way of speaking, "have you selected your team members yet? My calculations indicate that mixed species teams perform optimally in maritime challenges." Jake looked up from the materials he was examining. "I appreciate the offer, Kresh, but I think I'll work with the other humans if they're willing." Kresh tilted his long head in confusion. "But there are only 3 humans present today. Working only with your own species limits access to diverse skill sets and perspectives. Sometimes that's exactly what you need." Jake replied with a smile. He walked over to where Amy Chun and Ben Carter were watching the various teams organize. Amy was studying xenobiology and had become fascinated by how different species approached problem solving. Ben was in the physics program and had a good understanding of forces and motion. Want to build something interesting? Jake asked them. Amy grinned. I was hoping you'd ask. I've been watching these teams plan their rafts, and honestly, they all look pretty boring. Ben nodded in agreement. Functional, sure, but there's no innovation. They're all building the same basic design with minor variations. That's because they're thinking like engineers, Jake said. We're going to think like humans. He led them back to the materials pile and began selecting pieces that the other teams had ignored. Instead of the longest, straightest pieces, Jake chose wood that had natural curves and bends. He picked pieces of varying lengths and thicknesses. What are you thinking? Amy asked, genuinely curious. I'm thinking about every human civilization that ever lived near water, Jake replied. From ancient Egypt to Polynesia to the Vikings. Humans didn't just build things that float. We built things that sail. The word sail caused several nearby alien students to pause in their planning. It was not a concept that had come up in any of their discussions. The idea of using wind for propulsion seemed foreign to species that had developed technology to overcome natural forces rather than harness them. Jake spread his selected materials on the ground and began arranging them in a pattern that looked nothing like the rectangular frames the other teams were creating. His design was curved, pointed at both ends, and would require significantly more complex construction. Professor Zixnine floated over to observe his work. Her crystalline structure shifted to a curious yellow hue. Interesting approach, student. Morrison, your design parameters appear quite different from your classmates. Yes, Professor, Jake replied respectfully. I'm not just trying to solve the immediate problem. I'm trying to solve it well. Several other students had stopped their own work to watch the humans. Jake's approach was so different from standard engineering practice that it seemed almost alien to the actual aliens. They built things to meet specifications exactly. Humans apparently built things to exceed them. Ben picked up one of Jake's curved pieces and examined it. This is going to be a lot more work than a simple raft. Good things usually are, Jake replied, already planning the complex joinery that would hold his vessel together. As construction time officially began, teams scattered across the beach to begin building. The sounds of sawing, hammering, and alien languages filled the air. Most teams worked quickly, eager to finish their rafts with time to spare for testing and adjustments. Jake worked differently. He moved slowly and deliberately, taking time to shape each piece precisely. He carved notches and joints with the care of a craftsman rather than the speed of a student racing against time. Amy and Ben watched his process with fascination occasionally, helping but mostly learning from his methods. The human approach was becoming a spectacle. Other students found excuses to walk past their work area, curious about the strange curved shape taking form on the beach. Some whispered among themselves about the inefficiency of the human method. Others seemed intrigued by the unconventional design. As the hours passed, the difference in approaches became more obvious. The alien teams had functional rafts taking shape, practical and seaworthy. Jake was creating something that looked more like art than engineering, a graceful vessel that seemed to belong on the water rather than simply floating on top of it. The real test would come at sunset, when all their different philosophies would meet the same challenge, crossing the lake safely and efficiently. Jake continued his careful work, confident that sometimes the longest path to a solution was also the best one. 3 hours into construction time, the beach looked like a busy shipyard. Alien students worked with focused determination, their various appendages moving in efficient patterns as they assembled their watercraft. The air filled with the sounds of cutting, binding, and the occasional frustrated chatter when a design didn't work as planned. Jake continued his methodical approach, now shaping the hull of what was clearly becoming a boat rather than a raft. He had bent the curved pieces into a graceful form that came to points at both ends. The bottom was rounded, not flat like the rafts around them. Every joint was carefully carved and fitted together with precision that would have impressed an Earth shipwright. Amy Chun watched him work with growing amazement. "Where did you learn to do this?" she asked as Jake carved another perfect notch. "Summer camp, mostly," Jake replied, not looking up from his work. "My grandfather taught sailing when I was a kid. He was old school, believed you couldn't really understand boats until you built one with your own hands." Then Carter was studying the hull shape with his physicist's eye. "This design is actually genius. Look how the water will flow around it instead of just being pushed aside. The resistance should be much lower than those flat rafts." Around them, the alien teams were making impressive progress. The Vorthan team had constructed a perfectly rectangular raft with mathematical precision. Every measurement was exact, every angle perfectly square. Their six-armed coordination allowed them to work with remarkable efficiency. The raft was undeniably functional and would certainly complete the assignment requirements. The Klaxon team's approach was different but equally effective. They had divided into specialized groups, each handling a specific aspect of construction. One group cut materials, another handled assembly, and a third worked on quality control. Their raft was wider than the Vorthan design and featured raised edges to prevent water from washing over the sides. The Nereid team had taken advantage of their natural aquatic abilities. They had tested their design concepts directly in the water, making adjustments based on how the materials behaved when wet. Their raft incorporated subtle curves in the bottom that would help it move through water more efficiently than the purely flat designs of other teams. Professor Zix9 moved among the teams, observing progress and offering occasional guidance. Her crystalline form shifted colors as she evaluated each project. Green indicated approval, yellow showed curiosity, and red suggested concern. She had been glowing a steady yellow while watching Jake's work. "Student Morrison," she said, floating over to the human team's work area, "your construction is notably more complex than your peers. Are you confident you can complete it within the time limit?" Jake looked up from carving what appeared to be a flat paddle. "I'm confident it will be worth the extra effort, Professor. What is that component you're creating?" she asked, her form shifting to a brighter yellow. "A rudder," Jake explained, showing her the paddle-shaped piece and the mounting system he had carved for it. "It goes here at the back and lets us steer the boat precisely." This concept seemed to puzzle Professor Zix9. Her form flickered between yellow and blue as she processed the idea. "Steering? The assignment requires transportation across the lake. Navigation should be accomplished through coordinated paddling." "Should." "Yes," Jake agreed. "But there's a difference between meeting requirements and exceeding them." Amy had been watching the exchange with interest. "Professor, if I may ask, how do most species typically approach water transportation?" "Standard galactic practice involves platform construction for buoyancy and manual propulsion for movement," Professor Zix9 replied. "It is efficient and reliable." "But what about using natural forces?" Ben asked. "Wind, currents, that sort of thing?" Professor Zix9's form brightened with genuine curiosity. "Please elaborate on this concept." Jake set down his carving tools and stood up. "On Earth, humans learned early that fighting natural forces was exhausting and inefficient. Instead, we learned to work with them. We use wind to push our boats, and water currents to help guide them." He pointed to the longest piece of biomatter wood he had selected. "That's going to be a mast. We'll mount a sail on it to catch the wind." The concept of sail-powered transportation seemed to genuinely surprise Professor Zix9. Her crystalline structure cycled through several colors before settling on bright blue, which indicated fascination. "This approach is not documented in standard engineering databases," she said. "Wind force is typically considered an obstacle to overcome, not a resource to utilize." "Different perspective," Jake said simply, returning to his work on the rudder. Word of the humans' unusual approach was spreading among the other teams. Students found reasons to walk past their work area, trying to understand what Jake was building. The design looked like nothing they had studied in their engineering courses. Kresh, the Vorthan team leader, approached with several of his teammates. Their mathematical minds were clearly struggling to categorize Jake's boat. Your design efficiency appears suboptimal, Kresh observed, studying the curved hull. A flat surface provides maximum buoyancy with minimum material usage. True, Jake. Acknowledged, now working on the mast mounting system. But maximum buoyancy isn't the only consideration. This shape will move through water faster and more smoothly. But why does speed matter? Asked Vex, one of the younger Klaxon students. The assignment only requires crossing the lake. Amy stepped forward to help explain. That's the difference in thinking. You're solving the specific problem as stated. Jake is solving the general problem of water transportation. Ben added, it's like the difference between building something that works and building something that works well. The alien students seemed to find this distinction difficult to grasp. Their engineering education focused on meeting specifications precisely and efficiently. The human approach of exceeding requirements seemed almost wasteful to them. As afternoon wore on, the contrast between approaches became more stark. The alien rafts were nearing completion, practical and functional vessels that would definitely accomplish their task. Jake's boat was still under construction, but its elegant lines and sophisticated features were becoming impossible to ignore. Jake had now mounted the rudder system at the stern of his boat. The paddle could pivot left and right, connected to a simple tiller that would allow precise steering. No other team had incorporated any steering mechanism beyond the basic coordination of paddlers. The mast was next, a tall straight piece mounted securely in the center of the boat. Jake had carved a complex joint system that allowed the mast to be raised and lowered if needed. The engineering was more sophisticated than anything the alien students had attempted. 1 hour remaining, Professor Zix9 announced to all teams. Most of the alien teams began final assembly and testing of their rafts. Several teams launched their vessels for quick trials, making minor adjustments to improve stability or correct balance issues. The Vorthan raft performed exactly as their calculations had predicted. The Klaxon raft proved stable and seaworthy. The Nereid design moved through water smoothly. Jake was now working on the sail itself, using the provided fabric to create a triangular shape that would catch wind effectively. He had studied the lake and noticed the consistent breeze patterns. The sail was designed to work with the local wind conditions. Amy and Ben watched him work with growing excitement. They were beginning to understand that they weren't just building a boat to cross a lake. They were about to demonstrate thousands of years of human maritime innovation to species that had never considered working with natural forces instead of against them. Are you ready for this? Amy asked Ben quietly, ready to show them how humans really travel on water? Ben grinned, absolutely. Jake finished rigging the sail and stepped back to admire their completed vessel. It was beautiful, in a way that the practical alien rafts simply were not. Every line served a purpose, but the overall effect was elegant and graceful. The boat looked like it belonged on the water, like it had been designed by the water itself. Time, Professor Zix9 called out. All around the beach, alien students stepped back from their completed rafts. The vessels were functional and well-built, each reflecting the engineering principles of their builder's species. But sitting among them, Jake's boat stood out like a work of art in a toolshed. The real test was about to begin. The sun hung low in the sky as all teams gathered at the water's edge for the testing phase. A gentle but steady breeze rippled across the lake surface, creating small waves that would test each vessel's seaworthiness. Professor Zix9 hovered above the assembled students, her crystalline form cycling through colors of anticipation. Testing will proceed in order of team registration, she announced. Each vessel must successfully transport 3 crew members across the lake and return to this shore. Performance, safety, and efficiency will be evaluated. The Klaxon team launched first, their wide raft settling into the water with practiced efficiency. 3 crew members climbed aboard and began paddling in synchronized strokes. Their vessel moved steadily across the lake, though it sat low in the water and required constant work to maintain direction. Water occasionally splashed over the raised edges, but not enough to cause serious problems. Adequate performance, Professor Zix9 noted as the Klaxon raft reached the far shore and began its return journey. Functional design with acceptable stability. Next came the Vorthen team. Kresh and two teammates launched their mathematically perfect raft with confidence. The rectangular platform floated exactly as their calculations had predicted, and their six-armed coordination allowed for impressive paddling efficiency. However, Jake noticed they had to work constantly to keep the raft moving in a straight line, and the flat bottom caused it to bounce uncomfortably on the small waves. The Nereid team's raft performed better than the previous vessels, their understanding of water dynamics evident in the smoother ride and easier steering. Their curved bottom design cut through the water more efficiently than the flat rafts. Though they still relied entirely on manual paddling for propulsion, other alien teams followed, each demonstrating competent engineering and successful completion of the assignment requirements. All the rafts accomplished their task, but Jake noticed they shared common limitations: low speed, difficult steering, and complete dependence on crew effort for movement. Human team, you may launch, Professor Zix9 called out. Jake, Amy, and Ben approached their boat with quiet confidence. The elegant vessel looked even more graceful floating on the water than it had sitting on the beach. The curved hull settled naturally into the lake, riding higher than any of the rafts and shedding the small waves that had splashed over the other vessels. "This feels completely different," Amy said as she climbed aboard. The boat responded too, their movements smoothly, adjusting its balance automatically rather than requiring careful weight distribution like the rafts. Ben took his position near the tiller that controlled the rudder. "The steering system is incredible. I can feel how responsive it is even when we're not moving." Jake prepared to raise the sail. Around the shore, alien students and Professor Zix9 watched with intense curiosity. None of them had ever seen wind-powered. "Transportation in action, ready?" Jake asked his crewmates. "Ready," they replied together. Jake raised the triangular sail, and immediately the boat began moving forward without any paddling required. The fabric filled with wind, and the vessel accelerated smoothly across the water surface. The alien observers fell silent, watching in amazement as the human boat glided effortlessly across the lake. The performance difference was dramatic. While the alien rafts had struggled to maintain speed and direction through constant paddling effort, Jake's boat moved faster and more smoothly using only wind power. The Ben used the rudder to make small course corrections, demonstrating a level of control that none of the other vessels could match. "How is this possible?" Kresh called out from his raft, which was still paddling laboriously back to shore. "Wind power," Amy called back, grinning as their boat sailed past the struggling Vorthen team. "Humans learned to use natural forces thousands of years ago." Professor Zix9 accelerated her floating speed to keep pace with the human boat. Her crystalline form was cycling rapidly through colors of amazement and scholarly excitement. "Student Morrison, please explain the propulsion mechanism." "The sail captures wind energy and converts it to forward motion," Jake explained, adjusting the sail angle to catch a wind shift. "Instead of fighting against natural forces, we harness them to do the work for us." The concept seemed to revolutionize Professor Zix9's thinking. This represents a completely different philosophical approach to engineering. Rather than overcoming environmental obstacles, you incorporate them as design elements. "Exactly," Ben said, demonstrating the rudder control by making the boat change direction with minimal effort. "We don't just adapt to our environment, we partner with it." Their boat reached the far shore in less than half the time it had taken any of the alien rafts. The return journey proved even more impressive as Jake demonstrated advanced sailing techniques. He showed how to use wind from different angles, how to tack back and forth to maintain speed regardless of wind direction, and how the boat's design allowed it to work efficiently in various conditions. The alien students watching from shore were experiencing something unprecedented in their education. They had been taught that good engineering meant overcoming natural obstacles through superior technology and precise calculations. The humans were demonstrating that sometimes the best engineering meant dancing with nature instead of fighting. Observe the efficiency ratio, Professor Zix9 announced to her students. The human vessel requires minimal crew effort while achieving superior speed and maneuverability. Back on shore, other teams had completed their crossings and were discussing what they had witnessed. The Claxon students buzzed excitedly among themselves, trying to understand the physics of sail power. The Vorthans were recalculating their assumptions about optimal boat design. The Nereids, with their natural affinity for water, seemed most intrigued by the way Jake's boat worked with waves instead of fighting them. As the human boat approached the beach, Jake lowered the sail and let the vessel glide smoothly to a stop at the exact launching point. Not a drop of water had entered their boat during the entire test, and all 3 crew members looked fresh and relaxed rather than exhausted from paddling. Performance evaluation complete, Professor Zix9 announced, though her tone suggested she was still processing what she had observed. Jake stepped out of his boat and helped secure it on the beach. The alien students gathered around the vessel, examining its construction with new understanding. What had seemed like overcomplicated design now appeared sophisticated and purposeful. Kresh approached Jake with obvious respect. I must revise my assessment of your engineering approach. The efficiency gains are undeniable. It's not just about efficiency, Jake replied. It's about elegance. The best solutions are often the most beautiful ones. Vex, the young Claxon student, was studying the sail with fascination. But how did you know to build such a design? This technology is not in our engineering databases. Because it's not really technology, Amy explained. It's more like partnership. Humans learned to work with wind and water because we had to. Our planet taught us. Professor Zix9 hovered above the group, her form now glowing a steady, brilliant blue. Today has been most illuminating. We have witnessed not merely superior engineering, but a fundamentally different philosophy of design. She addressed all the assembled students. You have each successfully completed the assignment requirements. However, the human team has demonstrated something beyond mere completion. They have shown us innovation, elegance, and the integration of natural forces into engineering solutions. The alien students nodded in agreement, many still examining Jake's boat with obvious admiration. They were beginning to understand that there was more than one way to solve engineering problems, and sometimes the most ancient solutions were also the most advanced. As evening approached and teams began cleaning up their work areas, Jake noticed that several alien students were asking if they could study his boat more closely. Word was spreading that something significant had happened at the lake that day. The humans had not just built a better boat. They had introduced an entirely new way of thinking about the relationship between technology and nature. The following morning brought news that would change the Galactic Engineering Academy forever. Word of the human boat's performance had spread throughout the faculty overnight, and Professor Zix9 found herself fielding inquiries from colleagues across multiple departments. What had started as a routine student project had become the subject of serious academic interest. Jake arrived at the lake to find his boat surrounded by professors from various species, all examining the construction with intense curiosity. Professor Vel 7, the head of Advanced Propulsion Studies, was particularly focused on the sail mechanism. Professor Keth from Structural Engineering was studying the hull joints with obvious amazement. Student Morrison, Professor Zix9 called out as Jake approached. Your project has generated considerable interest among the faculty. Would you be willing to demonstrate your vessel's capabilities for our colleagues? Of course, Professor, Jake replied, though he was surprised by the attention his simple boat was receiving. Amy and Ben joined him as they prepared for what was apparently going to be a formal demonstration. Around the shore, students from yesterday's class gathered alongside the professors, eager to see the human boat in action again. Professor Vel 7 approached Jake with obvious excitement. Her species, the luminoids, communicated partially through bioluminescent patterns on their skin, and Her current display indicated intense scientific curiosity. Student Morrison, our databases contain no reference to wind-powered transportation systems. This appears to represent a completely novel approach to maritime engineering. Novel to you, maybe, Jake said with a smile. But humans have been sailing for thousands of years. It's one of our oldest technologies. This statement caused quite a stir among the assembled professors. The idea that in primitive technology could outperform modern engineering approaches challenged fundamental assumptions about technological progress, thousands of years. Professor Keth repeated, his rocky features showing surprise. You mean, this is ancient technology? Ancient and refined, Ben explained, climbing into the boat. Every human maritime culture contributed improvements over millennia. What you're seeing is the result of countless generations of innovation. Amy took her position as Jake prepared to raise the sail. The beautiful thing is how simple it is. No complex power systems, no exotic materials. Just wood, fabric, and an understanding of natural forces. As Jake raised the sail and the boat began moving across the lake, the professors watched with the intensity of researchers observing a major scientific breakthrough. The effortless speed and graceful maneuverability of the vessel challenged everything they thought they knew about optimal design principles. Professor Zix9 floated alongside the boat, recording detailed observations. Note the minimal energy input required for propulsion. The crew expends virtually no effort while maintaining superior speed compared to manually powered vessels. But how is directional control achieved? Asked Professor Valseven, observing Ben's use of the rudder. Water flow dynamics, Ben explained, demonstrating how small rudder movements translated to precise steering. The moving water creates pressure differences that push the stern left or right. The demonstration continued for over an hour, with Jake showing various sailing techniques and explaining the principles behind each maneuver. He showed how to sail at different angles to the wind, how to handle gusts and lulls, and how the boat's design automatically compensated for many of the problems that plagued the alien rafts. When they returned to shore, the professors immediately began an intensive examination of the boat's construction. Every joint, every design element, every seemingly simple feature was studied and documented. The complexity lies not in the individual components but in their integration, Professor Keth observed, running his rocky fingers along the curved hull. Each element serves multiple functions simultaneously. Professor Valseven was particularly fascinated by the sail system. The fabric capture mechanism is elegantly simple yet highly effective. Why have we not developed similar technologies? Because you've been thinking like engineers instead of like sailors, Jake replied. Engineers try to control everything precisely. Sailors learn to work with forces they can't control. This philosophical difference seemed to resonate with Professor Zix9. We have been approaching environmental challenges as obstacles to overcome rather than resources to utilize. Word of the demonstration spread quickly throughout the academy. By afternoon, students from other programs were arriving at the lake to see the human boat. Jake found himself conducting impromptu seminars on sailing principles, boat design, and human maritime history. The alien students' questions revealed how different their thinking was from human approaches. They wanted precise formulas for sail efficiency, exact calculations for hull optimization, and detailed specifications for every component. Jake tried to explain that much of sailing was intuitive, based on feel and experience rather than mathematical precision. But how do you determine optimal sail angle without computational analysis? Asked a crystalloid student whose species excelled at complex calculations. You feel it, Jake replied, demonstrating how the boat's movement and the sail's behavior provided constant feedback. The boat tells you what it needs. This concept of intuitive engineering seemed almost mystical to species that relied heavily on computational precision. The idea that a vessel could communicate its needs to its operator challenged their understanding of the relationship between technology and user. Amy had been observing the interactions with anthropological interest. I think what's happening here is more than just a demonstration of superior engineering. We're showing a completely different relationship with technology. How so? Asked Professor Zix9. Most species here seem to view technology as something that should eliminate uncertainty and provide complete control, Amy explained. Humans are comfortable with technology that requires skill, judgment, and partnership. Ben nodded in agreement. Our boat isn't just a machine you operate. It's more like a dance partner. You have to work with it, understand it, respond to its needs. This perspective seemed to fascinate the professors even more than the technical aspects of the boat. Professor Vel7 spent considerable time discussing the philosophical implications with her colleagues. As evening approached, Professor Zix9 called for attention from the assembled group. What we have witnessed today represents more than a successful student project. We have been introduced to a fundamentally different approach to engineering and technology. She gestured toward Jake's boat, which sat gracefully on the beach like a work of art. This vessel demonstrates that advanced technology need not be complex, that efficiency can emerge from simplicity, and that the best solutions often involve partnership with natural forces rather than domination over them. The professors and students gathered around as she continued. I propose that we establish a new research program to study human maritime technologies and the philosophical approaches that created them. There may be principles here that could revolutionize our understanding of optimal design. Jake felt slightly overwhelmed by the attention his simple boat was receiving. It's just a canoe with a sail, he said. Humans have been building them for thousands of years. Precisely, Professor Zix9 replied, her form glowing bright blue with excitement. And we have been building rafts for thousands of years, never thinking to improve upon the basic concept. Your species has demonstrated that innovation often means rediscovering wisdom rather than inventing complexity. As the crowd began to disperse, Kresh approached Jake with obvious respect. I have been reconsidering our entire approach to engineering challenges. May I request detailed instruction in your construction methods? Of course, Jake replied. But remember, the real secret isn't in the construction. It's in understanding that sometimes the best way to control something is to let it be free. The Vorthan student's elongated head tilted in thought as he processed this paradox. Around them, other alien students were having similar conversations, their worldviews quietly shifting as they began to understand the human approach to technology and nature. The day had started as a simple demonstration but had become something much more significant, the beginning of a new understanding of what engineering could be, when it embraced rather than fought the natural world. 3 weeks after the boat demonstration, the Galactic Engineering Academy had transformed in ways no one could have anticipated. Jake's simple canoe, now permanently displayed in the Academy's main hall, had become the centerpiece of a revolutionary new research program. Students from across the galaxy were arriving specifically to study human engineering approaches. Professor Zix9 had established the Institute for Integrated Natural Engineering, with Jake serving as the primary human consultant. Despite being just a student, the irony was not lost on him that his grandfather's old sailing wisdom was now being treated as cutting-edge galactic technology. The morning seminars Jake conducted had become the most popular classes at the Academy. Alien students packed the lecture halls to hear about human maritime history, the development of sailing technology, and the philosophical principles that guided human innovation. What fascinated them most was how humans had consistently chosen complexity and harmony over simplicity and isolation. Today, we'll discuss how humans learn to read weather patterns, Jake announced to a class of 200 students representing 15 different species. Early sailors had to understand wind, water, and sky as interconnected systems. In the front row, Kresh took detailed notes with all 6 of his arms, his mathematical mind struggling to quantify intuitive processes. Behind him, Klaxon students buzzed quietly among themselves, trying to understand how humans could make accurate predictions without computational assistance. But how do you calculate wind direction changes without atmospheric modeling? Asked a luminoid student whose species relied heavily on technological prediction systems. You don't calculate it, Jake replied. You feel it. You watch the water. Surface, observe cloud movements, notice how the air smells. Your body becomes part of the weather system. This concept of bodily integration with environmental systems seemed almost impossible for most alien species to comprehend. They had developed advanced technologies precisely to avoid such dependencies on biological intuition. Amy Chun, now serving as Jake's co-instructor, added her anthropological perspective. What Jake is describing is common across human cultures. We don't just use tools, we become part of the systems we're working with. Ben Carter had been working with the Academy's engineering department to analyze the performance characteristics of Jake's boat design. His data was revealing why the human approach was so effective, though the explanations challenged conventional engineering wisdom. The counterintuitive finding, Ben reported to the assembled professors, is that the boat's efficiency actually increases in challenging conditions. Rough water and variable wings make it perform better, not worse. Professor Val Seven studied the data with obvious amazement. This contradicts fundamental assumptions about optimal design. Most technologies perform best under controlled conditions. That's because most technologies fight against environmental variation, Jake explained. Our boat was designed to work with variation, to use it as an energy source rather than seeing it as a problem to solve. The implications of this discovery were rippling through multiple academic departments. The physics of dynamic systems had begun studying human surfing techniques. The Department of Fluid Dynamics was analyzing ancient Polynesian navigation methods. Even the psychology division was investigating how human consciousness integrated with environmental awareness. Professor Zix9 had become the Academy's most celebrated researcher, her studies of human engineering philosophy earning recognition throughout the galactic academic community. Her latest paper, Partnership Paradigms in Primitive Technologies, had revolutionized thinking about the relationship between advancement and complexity. The human approach suggests that our definition of advanced technology may be fundamentally flawed, she explained to a gathering of department heads. We have equated advancement with independence from natural forces. But the humans demonstrate that integration with natural forces can achieve superior results. The practical applications were already becoming apparent. Engineering teams across the galaxy were beginning to incorporate human-inspired design principles into their projects. The Vorthan shipbuilding industry had started experimenting with curved hulls and sail-assisted propulsion. Claxon construction firms were studying how human architecture worked with rather than against environmental forces, but the most significant changes were happening in the Academy's student body. Alien students were beginning to approach problems differently, asking not just, how can we solve this, but how can we solve this beautifully? Jake found himself at the center of a transformation he never could have imagined. His simple desire to build a proper boat had somehow triggered a galaxy-wide reconsideration of engineering philosophy. The responsibility felt overwhelming at times, but Amy and Ben helped him stay grounded. Remember, Amy said as they prepared for another PAC seminar, you're not teaching them to be human. You're teaching them to think like partners instead of conquerors. The seminar that morning was particularly significant because it included the Academy's first graduating class of students who had been trained in integrated natural engineering principles. Their final projects demonstrated how profoundly the human approach had influenced their thinking. A team of crystalloid students had designed a building that generated energy from temperature variations rather than fighting against them. Nereid engineers had created water purification systems that worked with biological processes rather than replacing them. Even the mathematically precise Vorthans had developed transportation systems that adapted to traffic patterns rather than trying to control them. These projects represent more than technical achievement, Professor Zix9 observed as she reviewed the student work. They demonstrate a fundamental shift in consciousness about our relationship with the universe around us. Dick watched the presentations with quiet pride, not for what he had taught, but for what these brilliant alien minds had discovered for themselves. They had learned that excellence often meant collaboration rather than domination. That elegance could emerge from working with complexity rather than eliminating it. The final presentation came from Kresh, whose Vorthan perfectionism had been most challenged by human approaches. His project was a transportation network that used gravitational flows and planetary rotation as energy sources, requiring no external power while providing faster and more efficient movement than traditional systems. This design would have been impossible using conventional engineering approaches, Kresh explained to the assembled audience. It required abandoning the assumption that optimal systems must be controllable systems. After the presentations, the Academy held a celebration ceremony. Jake's boat was formally inducted into the Academy's Hall of Innovation, joining displays of the galaxy's most significant technological achievements. The irony that a primitive wooden sailboat now sat alongside faster-than-light drives and dimensional processors was not lost on anyone. Professor Zix9 delivered the ceremonial address, her crystalline form cycling through colors of deep satisfaction and anticipation. Today we celebrate not just the completion of your studies, but the beginning of a new era in galactic engineering. She gestured toward Jake's boat, which seemed to glow in the hall's lighting. This simple vessel has taught us that advancement does not always mean complexity, that efficiency does not require control, and that the most profound technologies often emerge from profound wisdom rather than mere intelligence. As the ceremony concluded and students began to disperse to their homeworlds, Jake realized that his grandfather's sailing lessons had somehow become part of galactic civilization. The old man's stories about working with wind and water were now being studied by species across the galaxy. Amy found him standing quietly beside his boat, watching alien students examine its construction one final time before departing. "Any regrets about causing this revolution?" she asked with a smile. Jake considered the question seriously. "My grandfather always said that good boats want to be sailed by good sailors. I think good ideas want to be shared with good minds." Ben joined them, carrying data tablets full of research requests from universities across the galaxy. "Looks like you're going to be busy for a while. Half the galaxy wants to learn human engineering approaches." I guess we'd better teach them well," Jake replied, his hand resting on the curved rail of his boat. "Because once you start working with the universe instead of against it, there's no going back." The Academy's main hall gradually emptied. As students departed for home, carrying with them new ways of thinking about technology, nature, and the relationship between them, Jake's boat remained in its place of honor, a simple wooden reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas are also the most ancient ones. Outside, a gentle breeze rippled across the Academy lake, and Jake could swear he heard his grandfather's voice carried on the wind, laughing with delight at how far a simple sailing lesson had traveled.